How do we define intimacy, empathy, and interpretation? Katie Kitamura explores all these themes in her latest book and will join us to discuss that novel, Intimacies. What does it take to put an iconic musical on the stage? James Lapine will talk about his award-winning collaboration with Stephen Sondheim, Putting It Together, how Stephen Sondheim and I created Sunday in the Park with George. Elizabeth Harris joins us with news from the publishing world. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's August 6th. I'm Pamela Paul. Katie Kitamura joins us now from Sewanee, Tennessee, to talk about her new novel, Intimacies. Katie, hi.
Hi, Pamela. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. And from Sewanee, what are you doing there?
I am taking part in the Sewanee Writers Conference, which is a gathering of, I think, almost 200 writers. And there's a series of workshops and readings and many, many dinners and late nights.
All right. That sounds lovely and very un-quarantine-like.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a shock. I think everybody's adjusting to the experience of being in a room with other people and trying to remember how to socialize.
You know, that actually brings us to the subject of this novel, because I do feel like we're all relearning how to socially communicate with people
Yes.
in person and not on a screen. And I feel like when I see someone now, I'm like, hello, I am a person. And everything is like slightly off. And this book, Intimacies, is in part about language and communication. And why don't you tell us in your own words the premise of the book?
The novel is about a woman who moves from New York to The Hague in the Netherlands to take a job working as an interpreter at a war crimes tribunal. And very quickly she becomes entangled in a kind of series of professional and personal situations which destabilize her sense of the world around her and also of her place in it. And a lot of the novel is really occupied by her not only doing the interpretive work in the court, in her professional context, but also in her own life as she kind of scans the people around her and tries to understand what they're feeling, what their motivations might be, how they're reacting to her. So when you said that, it's a little bit related to the way I think we're all feeling. I mean, I certainly feel like a kind of almost hypersensitivity every time I meet a person now, as I'm trying to relearn all the cues of body language and everything else that is part of how we interact with people.
You know, it's interesting that you use the word destabilize, because I felt like, in a good way, this book destabilizes the reader. There's a slightly occasional, I don't know if this is the right word, but maybe off-kilter quality to the narration, and the narrator isn't named, and you sort of feel like you're a little bit, not uneasy isn't the right word, but Dwight Garner, in his review of this book, said that it casts a spell. And I felt like that was a very apt phrase, because you feel like you're caught up in the book, but you don't know your bearings. I don't know if that was deliberate somehow in the writing or in having a nameless narrator.
It's written in the first person, and it's not a terribly authoritative first person. It's much more a first person that speaks from a place of uncertainty. And one of the things that I think I try to do with that voice is to posit object A and then look at it from multiple angles and then say maybe it's actually object B. And so there's this constant undermining and destabilizing of the narrator's assessment of what is happening around her. She's a kind of hypothesis-generating machine in some way. She's constantly living in a kind of space of imagination. And I think as readers, we're very trained, or at least I feel very trained, to look for tension and resolution in plot. And one of the things that I try to do in my novel is to move the tension away from plot and instead put it in the territory of consciousness and interiority and what is happening inside of a character instead of what is happening in the world outside.
It is a lot about that world outside. I want to talk a bit about the setting of The Hague, which is one of those places that all of us have heard of, but probably not many of us have been to, even if we've been to the Netherlands. And it's also not a place where we think of people as living. It's a kind of way station because of its role in government.
Yeah, I love that word way station, because I think all of the characters, or not all of them, but certainly a number of the characters in the book are really in transit in some way, even though they might work at the criminal court or they might have a position there. In a lot of ways, they're outsiders who are just in the city for a period of time and they don't know for how long. And that transitory nature of the characters was really important, in part because I think the central character is trying to understand how sustainable this itinerant life really is for her. It's funny, I wrote the book and I did all the kind of novelty research that people do. I spent some time at The Hague. I sat in on a trial at the International Criminal Court, which is not precisely the court in the novel, but is the model for it in a way. Then I, went to the neighborhoods and picked the houses where my characters would be living. And it was only when I finished writing a complete draft of the novel that I realized that I had actually spent a fair amount of time in The Hague as a child. And I had these very free-floating memories of being there with my family that suddenly, when I realized that it was a Hague, I was able to look at a map and I was able to say that took place there and that took place there and that took place then. And there was something very powerful about being able to situate my memories in a particular place. And I ended up giving that experience to my central character on a subsequent draft.
Do you find that you do that often, that you give characters, whether in this novel or others that you've written, aspects of your own experience, dropping them in there like that?
I think I absolutely do. It's so interesting because I think people, and I would include myself in this when I'm reading in a slightly loose way, there's a tendency to associate the central character, particularly with a first-person narrator, with the author. And in my experience, I have a lot of friends who are writers, and when I read their books, I can see them all over the book, but it's not usually as direct as the narrator or the central character is them. It's more that I can see little pockets of a thought I've heard them express or an experience or a story I've heard them tell. I can see them in the book in terms of the mode of storytelling or the things that the book conceals or reveals. So I feel like as writers, we leave our imprint all over a book, but not always in the way that people think. I mean, in this case, I did give the narrator a couple of small anecdotal experiences that I myself had. They just felt almost too good to waste.
Give us another example.
There's a story in the book about a bookseller. He tells a little story about somebody who comes in and wants to buy something like, I don't know, I think the language is something like 10 yards of books.
Oh, right. This is like The Strand, does this too.
Exactly. And I have a friend who works in interior design who was describing a client coming in and saying they wanted a particular kind of book that would look a certain kind of way. And they had a very substantial budget to get those books, and they did not care at all what the content of the books was.
It's a very depressing little thing to drop into a novel. You talked about how the characters, in certain ways, slightly unreliable. She has a very partial understanding of the things that are going on around her. And while you describe the book as not plot driven, there are big things that happen in this book. There is her moving into the apartment of someone who she's been dating for a short period of time, who then kind of disappears. There's this violent mugging. And then, of course, there's this court case at the center of the book. And in all of these situations, it's not just the narrator, but the reader who doesn't really have a full, like a complete understanding of what actually is happening.
Yes, that was definitely something that I wanted to do from the very beginning when I was thinking about the novel. A lot of this novel, it was written in the last, I'm embarrassed to say, but I think I started writing it in 2016, so quite a while ago. Over those years, I really did have a sense of having only a partial understanding of these very large-scale historical narratives that were taking place around me. I had the understanding, I had the awareness that we were really in a history-making epoch on so many levels. But I often felt I was having trouble reconciling the very small-scale personal concerns that I had in my own life with these much larger events. And part of the novel is really wrapped up in trying to understand that gap and in trying to navigate a world where you feel like you only have pieces of a much larger narrative that might only fall into place or might only emerge at some later point. So the narrator is very much adjacent to the seat of power in her work. She is right up against an institution that is able to craft historical narratives in a lot of ways through these trials and through the recuperation of events. But she only sees fragments of it. She only sees slivers of the total narrative. And in part, that's because of the nature of her work, which requires a kind of over proximity. She has to be right up against the language that she's interpreting, which often prevents her from really understanding the content of the words she's speaking. And then that repeats itself in her personal life. She is, as you said, in a relationship with somebody who then leaves in order to, he tells her, to end his marriage or to finalize his separation from his wife. But there's an entire narrative that he is going through that she doesn't have access to. And, in my experience, that's also just what it's like to be with people, to be even with the people you know very, very well. There are large segments of their life that you don't have a total understanding of. And so that partial apprehension of what's happening, that was something that I wanted to try to get in the book.
There's this great passage in the book where she's met this man, Keys, at a party and has a certain experience with him and interaction with him that isn't altogether pleasant. And it's sort of in this much more flirtatious social context. And then later on encounters him in a professional setting. And it's like this dissonance of seeing this person completely outside their original context. And then she imagines what their earlier encounter might have been like if they hadn't been talking about who she came to the party with and instead had begun their conversation talking about the law.
One of the things I'm fascinated by is how much our understanding of people is really ruled by context. And that happens over and over again in the book. There's a moment when she's talking about the former president, who is a person who's being accused of various crimes against humanity, who she is interpreting for. And she looks at him, and there's a kind of baseline narrative that he is this charismatic figure or this troubling figure for people. And she looks at him in the court, and she suddenly sees his charisma kind of dissolve. She sees it kind of fall apart. And she realizes that a lot of that charisma is performance, and it's generated by the institution and the context of the court itself. And so that's a little bit what happens with this lawyer who she meets at a party, and she thinks of him really as a slightly, I don't know what the best way of describing him in that party is, but a kind of unpleasant.
Yeah, I was going to say a jerk.
Yeah, a jerk, an unpleasant kind of, a jerk, basically. And she's somebody who she thinks of as essentially superficial in some way. And then she sees him again in the context of the court, and suddenly he has all this authority. And I think she has that slightly strange experience of seeing very clearly that authority is just produced by the setting of the court, but also still somehow responding to it. And knowing that if she'd met him in that context originally, she would have had a very different assessment of him.
You have this really interesting passage towards the beginning of the book where you describe the delicacy of the interpreter's role. Can you read a little bit from that section of the book?
Sure. But fluency was merely the foundation for any kind of interpretive work, which demanded extreme precision. And I often thought that it was my natural inclination toward the latter, rather than any linguistic aptitude, that made me a good interpreter. That exactitude was even more important in the legal context, and within a week of working at the court, I learned that its vocabulary was both specific and arcane, with official terminology that was set in each language, and then closely followed by all the interpreters on the team. This was done for obvious reasons. There were great chasms beneath words, between two or sometimes more languages that could open up without warning. As interpreters, it was our job to throw down planks across those gaps. That navigation, which alongside accuracy required a certain amount of native spontaneity. At times you had to improvise in order to rapidly parse a difficult phrase. You were always working against the clock. That was more significant than you might initially think. With inconsistent interpretation, for example, a reliable witness could appear unreliable, seeming to change his or her testimony with each new interpreter. This in turn could affect the outcome of a trial. The judges were unlikely to note a change of personnel in the interpreter's booth, even if the voice speaking in their ears suddenly became markedly different, switching from male to female, from halting to deliberate.
I found this so profoundly interesting. It makes the interpreter's role really so important because it's not just about language, but it's almost a kind of acting role. They can enable a witness to be more or less sympathetic?
Before I started writing and before I started researching, I had a quite naive idea that the interpreter was, very similar in temperament to the translator. And I'd written a novel where the central character was a translator. And I somehow thought that this would be a, one-to-one equivalent. And I just slide over to a slightly different mode of relating to language. But when I met these interpreters, I realized that they were remarkably charismatic people. And they were really performers. They were very comfortable at occupying space. They were very comfortable at speaking. They were very, very good storytellers. And I really did begin to realize that interpretation as a word, we use the word interpret to talk about an actor performing a part or a musician interpreting a piece of music. And there's a lot that happens that is beyond language. And of course, if somebody says something that's a joke, you need to communicate that it's a joke and that it can't just be taken at face value. Or somebody says something ironic, you need to be able to modulate your tone in order to provide that context that is kind of extra linguistic.
Another word, in addition to interpret or interpretation, that you play with is the word in the title, intimacies, because when we think of that, we tend to think about romantic intimacy or sexual intimacy, but that's actually, it seems to me, not the intimacy that you're exploring in different ways in this novel. Instead, it's the intimacy that you have with someone who might otherwise be a kind of casual encounter, in this case, a man who's mugged. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And then, of course, the intimacy that you have as an interpreter when you're actually inhabiting that person's words by being their speaker.
I think intimacy as a word, as you said, is something that we think of as desirable and something that we seek out in our relationships in particular, but also in our friendships and in all the people that we care about. But I think it's a plural for a reason, which is that there's a lot of different kinds of intimacy in the novel. And a lot of them, as you say, are not desired. They're imposed on the narrator. It was only when I finished writing the novel that I realized that there are multiple incidents of sexual harassment and sexual intimidation in the novel. It's kind of sprinkled throughout. And, and afterwards I understood it because a novel is really about power, and sexual harassment is, of course, about power rather than desire. And so I think it made sense that there would be these little negotiations and these trespasses and these forced forms of intimacy throughout the novel. So I think it was thinking about all the different ways that word can play out and all the different ways that it occurs in your life. I mean, I think a kind of related word maybe to intimacy is also empathy, which again is a word which we're really encouraged to think of it as inherently a positive and something that we should be trying to feel. I have children and, you want empathetic children. But the narrator has a kind of disturbing moment where she feels an excess of empathy for the man that she is interpreting for. And that's actually something that she doesn't want. It actually feels like a trespass for her to be placed inside his point of view and to find herself, if not exactly rooting for him, but finding herself very permeable and finding it all too easy to occupy the space of his perspective. And so that duality, the fact that the things that we're taught from a very early age to desire can actually unravel in our hands, was something that I was thinking about in this novel.
All of those themes bring us to this painting that's at the center of the novel as well.
Yes.
And so just before we end, I want to ask about that painting and if that was something that you came across when you stayed in The Hague as part of research for this novel, or if you were already aware of this painting and of how it was going to fit in.
I went to the Moritz House and I spent an afternoon there looking at and there's really very, very extraordinary art there. And I was very taken by this painting.
What was the painting?
It's a Judith Leyster painting called The Proposition. And it's a very strange painting of a young girl who is, as I write in the book, virtually every part of her body is concealed except for her hands and her face. And there's a man, and she's working on a piece of embroidery, and there's a man who is kind of leaning into her, and he has in his outstretched hand, he has some coins that he's offering to her. And it's not entirely clear what he's offering her the money for. It's not quite, or at least it wasn't clear to me what the exchange was. But the title of The painting is a man, I think it's something like Man Offering a Woman Money, but I think the kind of informal title that it's known by is The Proposition. And it was when I was looking at it, I was very struck by the fact that there are kind of two competing points of view. There's the woman who looks frightened and like she's trying to kind of almost shrink as much as possible. And then there's a man, he looks lecherous, but almost as if in his head he thinks he might be romantic. And there was something about those two conflicting points of view that I realized that it felt to me very much a painting that had been made by a woman somehow. And Judith Leyster herself has a very interesting career in that she was one of very few women who were in the Guild, but whose reputation, I think, she's kind of moved in and out of the canon, so to speak. And I think more recently her work has been fully appreciated and contextualized and restored. But I think for a long period, she was not terribly well known. And so that history was also interesting to me. But I was really interested in this particular scene in the novel and thinking about the overarching context of the institution of the museum and the question of, who is allowed in the museum, who's not allowed in the museum, both in terms of guests, but also in terms of the artwork. Who is the person who is shaping the canon? Who are the people who are deciding what paintings are part of that canon and what paintings are not? So that all seemed to kind of coalesce inside this particular work, which allowed me to talk about various levels of the art world.
I'm going to leave the rest of those questions that you just posed and thinking about that to people who have not yet read this book. I don't want to give anything further away. I feel like this is the perfect novel. If it's a summer day and it's pouring rain, you have the absolute excuse to sit inside for an entire day and read a book, and you can read this one. It's so absorbing. And it does, I think, as Dwight put it in his review, cast a spell. So, Katie, thank you so much for being here.
Pamela, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
Katie Kitamura's new novel is called Intimacies. Tina Jordan joins us now to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the New York Times Book Review. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So I'm bringing you today an interesting story from 1938 in which Pearl S. Buck, who was then arguably, if not the most popular writer in the country, one of the most popular writers. She topped bestseller lists in the 1930s. But at this book and author lunch at the Essex House, which was sponsored by the American Booksellers Association, she gave a speech in which she said, "I wish to heaven that we could do away with the bestseller list entirely. It is not a thermometer. It is an iron mold clamped upon the public mind." She went on to say, "We American novelists have not the consolation of novelists in other countries that if we are not bestsellers, we are nevertheless appealing to a small select few. In America, there aren't any small select few, and if you aren't best-selling, you aren't selling. And if you aren't selling, then that's the worst thing that can happen to you." She's speaking to booksellers here. If you would refuse to have bestseller lists or to support them, I'm sure there would be plenty of us who write books who would heartily support you. I know it has been tried, but I wish it could be tried again. Now, the other interesting thing is that one of the people at the lunch was J. Donald Adams, who was then the editor of the New York Times Book Review, and he obliquely supported her. And he said, "Books, in large part, are becoming extension of yesterday's newspaper headlines. The world has become a huge Pandora's box of troubles, and all of them find a place between book covers. I don't mean to say that there is no place for journalism in book publishing. In a world such as ours, it's even a necessary place. But at a time when external affairs press upon us so insistently and so hard, when it is difficult to think beyond each day's disquieting news, I believe that everything possible should be done to keep alive that older conception of what books can be and can mean to us." I figured that would appeal to you, Pamela.
Yeah, that feels very timeless.
It does, doesn't it?
You would have liked him, Mama, you would. Mama, he makes things Mama, they're good. Just as you said from the start, children and art. Children and art. He should be happy.
James Lapine joins us now. His new book is called Putting It Together, How Stephen Sondheim and I Created Sunday in the Park with George. James, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's really my pleasure.
You have a little bit of kind of memoir woven throughout this book, particularly in the beginning. So I'd love to just pause a little bit on you before we get into the story of this book and of the show. How did you get started in the theater? What first drew you?
Well, I came to the theater rather late in life. I didn't do my first theater piece, as it was, until I was about 28 years old. So it was an odd trajectory from being a photographer, graphic designer, and at which point, as a graphic designer, I was hired to design a theater magazine out of the Yale School of Drama. And following the year I did that, I was invited to the Yale School of Drama to work full-time as their in-house graphic designer. And while I was there, in a sense, I got an education in the theater and went to a lot of the student shows as well as the Yale Repertory Theater shows. And the head of the drama school then was Robert Brustein, and he did something really interesting, which is in January, he asked everyone who was in the school to take 2 weeks off and do something outside their area of expertise. And that included the faculty, and I was teaching a course in graphic design. And my students said, well, you should direct a play. And I said, well, okay, find me a play and I'll try my hand at directing a play. Because I was very interested in avant-garde theater and the fringe stuff, which was not common at the Yale School of Drama. It was more a traditional school in that regard. They found me this play called Photograph by Gertrude Stein, which I thought, well, the title's good. I can do that. And it was 3 pages long.
It's a good starting play.
Yeah, it was 3 pages, but 5 acts. So I did a kind of theme and variation on that poem play of hers. The show lasted over an hour. And just by continually doing it with a different visual take each time. And a friend of mine who was a stage managing student produced this as part of her January program. And she said, I wish we could do it in New York. And I thought, well, be my guest. So she, first of all, found a loft space in Soho, but we didn't have any money. And a friend of
What year was this?
This would have been around, 78, 77, something like that. And a friend of mine was writing her doctoral dissertation on Jasper Johns, and she casually mentioned, Jasper Johns loves Gertrude Stein. And she got me his address. I wrote him, and lo and behold, $2,500 came to me in the form of a check, and we ended up putting this piece on in a loft space in Soho. And another friend of mine, most of my friends were in the art world, so can I do anything to help? And naively, I said, I don't even know how you get people to review stuff. Maybe you could get somebody to review it. And she naively called up the lead critic of the New York Times at the time, Richard Eder, and somehow talked him into coming and seeing it. And he loved it and wrote a wonderful review of it. And suddenly I was working in the theater.
If only all reviews worked that way. Wouldn't that be nice? So it was only a few years later that you first met Stephen Sondheim, 1982. Take us back to that moment. How did you meet, and what was that first meeting like?
I had a piece that I was interested in doing called A Cool Million by Nathaniel West, an adaptation. I thought it could be a musical, and I was working with a fellow named Stephen Graham at the time, who's no longer in the theater, but he produced my first play. And we were in his office, and a gentleman named Lewis Allen, who at the time was a kind of big Broadway producer, came in, and we were saying, gee, we're looking for somebody to do the music on this little piece. And he said, well, what about Stephen Sondheim? I was not that educated in mainstream theater, but of course I knew of him, even though I'd only seen one of his shows. And he called Steve Sondheim, and much to my amazement, he told me that Sondheim, he had seen the 2 shows I had done off Broadway. And he said, I'd love to meet him. So that was the introduction. And I believe it was one Sunday, I showed up at Stephen Sondheim's house, knocked on the door, and there we were.
And was it sort of an immediate connection where you knew you wanted to work together?
Well, it wasn't an immediate connection in any way, but it was a very relaxed meeting. And I came in and he sat down and rolled a joint. And
Well, that would relax things.
yes, it relaxed things immediately. And basically, we just talked to each other about our backgrounds and our history. And it was more a kind of social call. And he said he would, of course, read A Cool Million and get back to me. And I think it was really helpful that I didn't know much about him, frankly, because I wasn't intimidated in any way. And I think it was just I don't know, we just kind of hit it off in a lovely fashion. He called back maybe in a week and said, I read A Cool Million. And, I'd already done Candide, which frankly is the same story as A Cool Million. But if there's something else you'd like to do, I'd love to talk to you about it. He was coming off a show that did not do well on Broadway called Merrily We Roll Along, which is a great show, but for whatever reason, it closed right away. And so he was kind of down in the dumps and maybe looking for a change. And so I think it was a bit of kismet that we happened to be introduced at that particular moment in our lives.
How did you come to decide to write a show about a painting by George Seurat?
Well, it brings us back to photograph, because one of the sections that I did of that piece was Sunday in the Island of Le Grand Jatte, that painting, which I had always loved and been totally fascinated with. So I used it as one of the inspirations for one of the sections of the Gertrude Stein piece. So it was always kind of on my radar. And as we were discussing projects, I was so downtown at the time, I brought a bunch of images over for us to look at, thinking it might spark our imagination. And one of those images was a postcard of the painting. And that's the one we kind of latched onto and started talking about and looking at together and, discovering all the oddities of the painting. And I said to Steve, well, there's somebody missing here. And he said, who? And I said, the artist. And that sort of notion of writing about the person who made the painting came to be. And that's what I ran off and began writing.
All right. For those who were not lucky enough to see the original production or to ever see it or see the 2017 revival, just give us a basic sense of what the show is about.
It's really about creation and making something. I like that the book is called Putting It Together, because no matter what field you're in, even if you're not in the arts, I'm fascinated with process and how people make things. And even if they're in the world of business or whatever people do, how they get around to creating something. And we ended up writing a show about that. And by studying the painting, we both sort of dove in without doing a lot of research on Seurat. But of course, once we got going, then we got into great depth into that painting and that painter. And one of the ironies of this piece is we discovered that we started writing this 100 years after Seurat started painting his painting. And it took Seurat 2 years to paint the painting, and it took us 2 years to write the show. So there was a kind of wonderful symmetry about the entire process. But I'm not somebody who sits down and goes, I'm going to write about this, that, or the other thing, or this is my theme. And I tend to just dive into the deep end and just see what my mind creates without any particular intention. And Steve works sort of the opposite way. And he's very analytical and very detail-oriented. And he writes his songs slowly and with great intention and detail. So we were kind of coming together in two very different ways as creators.
There is also a parallel in your two books, Putting It Together and Finishing the Hat, both with titles referencing this particular show, and both of which are kind of memoirs, but also not quite. Was the original idea to write a memoir?
I had no intention to write a memoir, but I happened to meet Jonathan Galassi from Farrar Straus just socially a couple of times, and he was just kind of asking me about my life and how I got involved in the theater, and he said, you should write a memoir. And I thought, I'm not going to write a memoir. And I kind of left it at that, and then I happened to be sitting in the theater watching a revival of Sunday in the Park with George, and I was not involved really in that revival, and I'm kind of drinking my beer and watching it, and about 20 minutes in, I go, this is a really strange show. And I said to myself, who wrote this? And, it was 35 years after the fact, and I thought I'd like to retrace that creation, the creation of the show about creation. And that was kind of the germ of what became a kind of memoir and also a kind of oral history.
I mean, it's an interesting question that you asked. Who wrote this? Do you feel like you were a different person at that time? Did it feel like a kind of excavation of this earlier version of yourself?
Absolutely. Part of the pleasure in writing the book was rediscovering who I was at the time. Because you're so involved in something, you're not outside of it. And maybe it takes 35 years to look back at it to realize what was actually going on. And in some cases, I got to understand myself better by talking to people who were there at the time and hearing what their stories were and stories about me. It actually was kind of an excavation of sorts, both of the show and the creative process, and what it's like for someone in my position as a writer and a director to do his first Broadway show.
I want to talk about that writing process and the directing process, but let's talk a little bit about who you went back and interviewed, because you spoke to over 40 people, and the names of the people involved in the show. Obviously, there's Stephen Sondheim, Andre Bishop, and then your cast, Mandy Patinkin, Bernadette Peters, Christine Baranski, Kelsey Grammer. What was it like going back and talking to them, not only about how they viewed the experience, but also their version of what they saw in you?
Well, first of all, I was totally thrilled that almost everyone was willing to have a conversation about it. And not only that, but being very open about what the experience was like for them and very open in their comments about me. And I would have to say the book is not always very flattering of me. And I enjoyed that honesty and understanding what I was going through from somebody else's perspective other than my own. And to that degree, in all honesty, some people I think had made a kind of glossy picture of it all. People who I found maybe difficult to work with, or that's my memory, somehow were telling me it was, the greatest experience they ever had. So I think there's a little painting going on in our own lives, what we choose to remember and what we don't. It was quite fascinating, and some of these people I hadn't seen in 35 odd years. So on so many levels, it was actually very touching.
Who hadn't you seen?
Well, most of the actors, actually, some of whom were no longer in the business. My stage manager became a physical therapist and moved to Hawaii. People that you were in the room with for a year and a half and forged a working relationship with. And then that's the mystery of the theater often, is that we scatter and go our separate ways, and sometimes we never connect again. And there are others like Mandy and Bernadette who I remained incredibly close to since and worked with since. And I think the fact that we went through that very trying experience of making the show joined us at the hip for life.
I mean, the honesty is very apparent throughout this book that you mentioned earlier. Let's just take Mandy Patinkin. At one point, he walked off the show. What happened?
I think he had a meltdown. And I could relate to Mandy, frankly, because I'm, at that time anyways, was also a kind of 1 foot out the door kind of guy. And I think he explains it very well in the book as he looks back. I think this was his first leading role. I think he didn't realize that we were doing a workshop and people were coming in to see his work, and he didn't feel prepared. And he didn't think the show was ready to be seen. And to that degree, I would have to agree with him now. Back then, I didn't really think much about it. I just assumed everyone understood they were coming to see a work in progress. But somehow, no matter how much you tell an audience that, they're still going to sit back in judgment. And I think he just had to get out of that room. And I kind of chased him down the street. And I was not an experienced director, which a more experienced and older director, I think he would not have had the kind of insecurities that he had, but he was working with somebody who had less experience than him rather than more. And we just talked it out. I said, look, if you want to leave the show, you should leave the show, but you can't walk out of a room when we have a show this evening. And it's not the way to handle it, and come back, do the show this evening. As it happened, his wife and agent were coming to see it. And I said, after they see it and you discuss it with them, if you feel you have to leave, then you should leave. And I don't know where I got the wisdom to do that, because inside I was shaking, because I thought, if this guy leaves the show, there ain't no show. But somehow I realized from my very first show, where I had an actor who wanted to quit, and my producers sat me down and they said, look, this guy doesn't want to do this, and stop trying to hold on to him and convincing him to do it. Why do you want to work with somebody who doesn't want to be in your show? And it was maybe one of the best pieces of advice I ever got. And I took it to heart. And I thought, if somebody doesn't want to be there doing it with me, then I'm not going to hang on to them for life. I'm just going to, let them go. So that's how I responded to Mandy. And he came around. And I think it does admit in the book that it was very, very hard for he and Bernadette to get out there every night in a show that was not finished. And as he said also in the book, he somehow felt it was his responsibility to make the show work, which of course it really wasn't, but that was where his head was at. So it was an interesting encounter to revisit.
Explain that a little bit more. A show that wasn't finished. What wasn't finished about it, and how did it get finished before it opened on Broadway?
Well, it wasn't finished. It was very unusual that somebody would actually put a show on Broadway with no second act. But, as one of my producers reminded me, the theaters were half empty at that period of time. That's when Times Square was not the Times Square we know now, but was a crime-ridden porno center of the city. And Broadway was really hurting. And they had to get shows into theaters. And Sondheim was, of course, a big name. And the producers just took a chance putting him and me into taking this show forward. And we were fortunate in having Mandy and Bernadette, because they were known quantities, so they knew that they could sell a certain number of tickets on their name and Sondheim's. But we hadn't fleshed out the second act. We knew what it was, and we knew what we wanted it to be. But for some reason, a reason, Sondheim never finished the penultimate song and the one prior to it in the second act. And those songs were always built to kind of help the audience understand what the show and what the act was about. I think the other issue we faced was people, after a lot of work, came to really enjoy the first act. And they found the second act, which takes place not in the 19th century, but the 20th century, so jarring that they really couldn't make the leap.
You've worked on many, many shows. You could have written a book about many different shows that you've worked on in one capacity or another, as a playwright or as a director. Why this one? What makes Sunday in the Park with George special to you?
Well, obviously, it was my first Broadway show, and it was trial by fire. I mean, if I had done that show and it had closed in one night, I probably wouldn't have done as much subsequent work as I had been able to do.
And of course, it went on to win a Pulitzer.
That's true. That didn't hurt. I think it's an enigmatic show, and I think I learned everything I know about the theater and about being a writer and director from having written that show. And I did learn most of it at the feet of Stephen Sondheim. So I wanted to share that, frankly. When I started out in this odd trajectory into the theater, I went to look for books to read about it. And there was a dearth of books, particularly on directing. And I thought, there's something valuable here. If I can write this experience down and get a book published, it will be so helpful to other people who are studying theater, who want to understand the alchemy of theater. And I was excited frankly, to kind of leave that document behind, because I think there aren't many documents that are books that go into the detail that this one does.
It's such a poignant moment for this book to be coming out, because of course, Broadway is just now tentatively starting to get back on its feet and open up again. What was it like for you having Broadway shut down? I mean, you had a show that was ready to go into previews at the Beaumont the Thursday before Broadway closed.
It's called Flying Over Sunset, and it was to begin previews that night that Broadway closed.
Okay, even more dramatic.
Really dramatic. And we were, all dressed up with nowhere to go at 4:00 when, obviously, the drum was beating in the distance. But all I wanted to do was have that one show with an audience, and we didn't get it. I don't know why, but I didn't let the cast go, and we performed it that night for people who were at Lincoln Center, and I made them come in the next day to rehearse. And the day after that, I went to my office and I wrote all my notes down, all my writing notes, all my directing notes, everything, folded it all up, put it in a drawer, and frankly forgot about it. I just decided I'm not going to feel sorry for myself. I'm going to finish writing that book about Sunday in the Park with George. And that's what I did. I was very lucky to have that project to finish up.
But the show is opening up later this year. How are you feeling about the future of Broadway right now as we come back from basically a year and a half?
I hope we all come back changed. I mean, I certainly know I am. And I have to say, and maybe it's a sign of where we are, I'm not putting my whole heart into coming back because we're still in the middle of COVID cases rising, and I'm not sure what's going to happen between now and going into rehearsal in October. So I have to say, I know that when we come back, I will appreciate theater and the people I work with in the process even more than I already do for what we've all gone through. And one of the lovely things about this time has been we've stayed together. My cast and crew, those that wanted to, have Zoomed every month and kept our relationship alive and our friendship alive. And I think that's kept me alive to a certain degree, at least spiritually.
Let's leave our listeners with a song. Tell us about one of the pieces from Sunday in the Park with George, what it meant to you, whether it's your favorite one or the one that has stuck with you the most.
I don't really have favorites. I think what's an interesting song is a little song called Lesson Number 8. And this was I believe it was the last song that came into the show. What's interesting about Lesson Number 8 is it's simply a song where the character, second act George, sits on the stage and goes through his grandmother's lesson book in which she wrote certain notes and comments to herself. And he turns the song Sondheim into a lesson book song where the lead character, Mandy Patinkin, who plays him, goes from talking about the boy and Marie in the book to himself. And by doing so, within the context of this song, he's actually able to summon the 19th century. And that's how we go full circle in the show.
All right, let's listen to a few moments of Lesson Number 8.
George is afraid. George sees the park. George sees it dying. George too may fade, leaving no mark, just passing through. Just like the people out strolling on Sunday. George looks around. George is alone. No use denying. George is aground, George has outgrown what he can do. George would have liked to see people out strolling on Sunday.
James, such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Really, really has been great.
James Lapine's new book is called Putting It Together, How Stephen Sondheim and I Created Sunday in the Park with George. Liz Harris joins us now with some news in the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela. So this week, we're going to look at the New York Times bestseller list, because if you look at the top 10 nonfiction bestsellers this week, 6 of them reflect the incredible political divide in this country. And it's so fascinating. In the top 10, there are 3 books about the end of the Trump presidency that each take a very dim view of how it went. There's I Alone Can Fix It by 2 Washington Post reporters, Carol Leonnig and Philip Recker, which was published by Penguin Press. There's Landslide by Michael Wolff, published by Henry Holt. Frankly, We Did Win This Election by Wall Street Journal reporter Michael C. Bender, which is published by 12. And on the right, we've got 3 very different books. There's American Marxism by Mark Levin, published by Threshold. And this is a Fox News host talking about issues like the Green New Deal, social activism, and critical race theory. There's The Authoritarian Moment by Ben Shapiro, published by Broadside, describing what he considers to be threats to American business, education, and politics. And then How I Saved the World by Jesse Waters, who is another Fox News host, published by Broadside. And Waters is writing about his career and fighting what he describes as left-wing radicalism. So conservative books, as we see, are really lucrative. And these were all published by conservative imprints at major houses, 2 at HarperCollins and 1 at Simon & Schuster. But the industry is really splitting on this because even though the staff at mainstream publishing houses tend to skew left, they've long published books all across the political spectrum. But that's been getting harder for them to do in the face of really intense outrage and protest from their staff. So increasingly, conservatives who work in publishing are setting up their own ecosystem of independent houses and things like that. And these imprints are a part of that. But it's interesting because it's this huge market, but the number of editors who are acquiring these books is really quite small. But there are a ton of readers out there for them.
One of the standard truisms is that the party that is in power helps the other side in many ways, including book ways, and that if there's a Democratic president, then people are going to want to read more from the opposition, or the opposition kind of gets fired up. So it feels natural that now would be a time, too, with a new Democratic administration, that people would be interested in hearing, or certain readers would be very interested in hearing what conservatives have to say.
That's totally true. And there are a lot of personality books around that. Like there were so many anti-Trump books when Trump was in office. But Biden, and there were, were a lot of anti-Obama books, a lot of anti-Clinton books, that kind of thing. But Biden isn't that, he's not really perceived of in publishing as someone who's going to sell a lot of books.
Right.
Like he's just sort of not that, he's like not that controversial, like things, he's not that threatening, to the other side, it seems. So it just, there's more of a focus, it seems, on issue books rather than personality books.
That is kind of interesting, too. I mean, similarly, Jill Biden isn't a target in the way that, say, Hillary Clinton was during Bill Clinton's presidency. What are they going to write about?
It seems like they're finding stuff.
It seems like they are, and I'm sure more to come. Liz, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Our critics Jennifer Salai and Dwight Garner join us now to talk about what they are reading and reviewing. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Jen, let's start with you. What did you write about recently?
So I reviewed a book called Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine by Jeff Maynaw and Nicola Twilley. It's one of those books, as you can tell by the title, that it just sounds ultra timely, as if they wrote it in response to the last year and a half. But actually, one of the very interesting things about this very interesting and somewhat strange book is that they started researching it years ago. So obviously, COVID-19 comes into play when they talk about pandemics, but what they do is they actually take a really expansive look at what quarantine is, and they go through its history, how our first traditional quarantine started in Dubrovnik as well as Venice, places where trade took place during the Black Death. And so that was an era when strangers were coming into contact with each other. And so the idea of quarantining individuals who weren't necessarily sick, but were maybe sick, became something of a practice. And so they look at the history of quarantine. What they emphasize is that we understand it in terms, I think we use it often interchangeably with the idea of isolation, so isolating people who are actually sick. But what they say is central to the idea of quarantine is uncertainty. We don't know exactly what's happening with somebody, that they might have something dangerous inside of them. And so we have to keep them safe and keep the rest of the population safe. Their big argument is that with scientific and medical developments, that you would think in some ways that quarantine is this medieval, outdated technology from the past. But what they're saying is actually it's going to be more and more important, because modern life, on the one hand, we can diagnose people, in theory at least, more efficiently when it comes to certain diseases. But on the other hand, it really also brings people into contact with each other. I mean, plane travel is a huge vector for infection, as we know. And so it's going to become more important, they say. And so they look at it from the perspective of disease. They look at it from the perspective of agricultural pests. And they also look at it philosophically. And what they point out, as the title suggests, is that our idea of quarantine actually really goes against, especially in the United States, I think a lot of values that we often hold dear, such as the idea of innocent until proven guilty. So quarantine is a system that basically says somebody is unsafe until they're proven safe. And so it's the kind of power that should be used really judiciously. It should be used compassionately, because historically it's also been abused.
This is a really serious topic, but I have to say, from their author photos, these two authors, there's like a photo of the two of them in kind of early plague gear.
Right.
That makes it seem
Right.
like perhaps they have a fun approach to their subject. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. So that photo, actually, I think it's only one of them who's in the PPE gear. The other person who's in the medieval Black Death gear is
Yes, that's what I liked.
Right, is one of the scholars that they met, I think, several years ago. So this was before COVID-19. I feel like that's another thing where I think at the time that they were working on their subject, it was not necessarily something that people had in mind. So when they went to places like Italy, where there's like a long history of quarantine, they met with people who really understand the past and how it worked. And so this plague gear is something actually that's become a bit of a caricature. I think that, when we see it, it looks both comical as well as menacing. But the thing about actually the medieval plague gear, something I didn't know, was that in that long beak, if you can picture it, was often doctors.
It's terrifying.
It's terrifying. But they would stuff things like herbs and garlic. And that was supposed to protect them from infectious disease. And at the time, they didn't really know. I mean, they thought that infectious disease was spread by miasma. Some of these herbs, things like garlic, I mean, those actually did have antibacterial properties. So they contrast it with the PPE gear. But the thing about PPE, which is something that's supposed to protect medical personnel from infectious people, is that it's extremely onerous to put on. And as we learned within the last year and a half, the supplies for it aren't necessarily always easily procured when there's a pandemic that affects the entire world. I don't know if their approach to their subject is comical, but they really point out, I think, a lot of interesting arcane details that we wouldn't necessarily think about.
So was it a fun book at all?
Well, I will say that I learned a lot, and I give them a lot of credit as writers. They really wanted to take a really big approach to their subject. So he runs an architectural and technology blog, and she is the co-host of a podcast about food and science and history. So I think they have a really wide range of interests. Because of that, they approach the subject as something that should be looked at expansively. And I think in that sense, it is fascinating. I mean, it's not like a dry specialist's book. They really journey across the world, and you see them meeting with people, looking at historical sites. They talk about space travel, because quarantining things before they go into space is a big deal, as well as quarantining things that are brought back from space. They talk about this idea of a celestial pandemic, which is something that people were very afraid of with the lunar missions.
Are we still afraid of that? Do we still think that that is a real possibility?
That seems to be less of an issue as the fear that we're actually going to set off something by going into space without properly sterilized equipment. I mean, I think when Elon Musk, he sent with his SpaceX like a unsterilized Tesla into space. I mean, I think those are things that people do worry about. Those are things that scientists worry about. But at the same time, a lot of it is unknown. And the thing about quarantine that's really tricky is because it has to do with unknowns, oftentimes in retrospect, it looks like total overreaction. And as I said in the past, because it is...
I'm thinking about, spraying like things onto fresh direct deliveries of, food in those early days.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, we didn't know. I was leaving mail outside for like 24 hours before bringing it in because, we didn't necessarily know how the coronavirus was spread. And so what they say is that we have to think of a way of approaching quarantine that is smart, that also builds trust, because it only works when there's trust. Because again, historically, the power has been abused to often marginalize already marginalized populations in the name of disease control. So they look at this very serious issue, but they also bring into it little bits of history, little bits of philosophy, as I said, little bits of space travel. So it's completely fascinating.
All right, Dwight, over to you.
I reviewed an interesting book. Well, it's funny, you were talking with Jen about the author photographs on her book, and it made me think that it's been a long time since I've read a smart piece about the author photograph in America, because for a long time we had this period where the photographer Marian Ettlinger ruled, and she had these sort of oily, very just so photographs of writers that were intense and on the dark side of things. And since she largely stopped doing work, no one really has grabbed the mantle. It made me think about what the author photo is these days. It made me think about the book I reviewed this week too, because I reviewed a book of short stories called After Parties by Anthony Visna So. And in alas, this is his first book. It's also posthumously published. He died of a drug overdose in December. And it made me think about author photographs and charisma, because clearly this young man was beloved. When you look at photographs of him, clearly charming, big personality, Cambodian American, tattooed, and a lot of people really reacted to his death in a way that you don't hear about a lot of writers. And it made me worry about the book. It made me think that, well,
now it's going to be terrible.
But yeah, in a James Dean kind of way, the loss of the great talent, and perhaps we're overselling his skills as a writer, because as we all know, charisma and a good author photograph don't really matter on the page. And these stories, they just about live up to the hype. I want to be careful and qualify it, but he's a very witty and very charming writer, and these stories are set in California's Central Valley, and his characters are Cambodian Americans who, as poet Charles Simic once said, have bought the American dream, but it hasn't quite been delivered yet. There's an auto body story that is really funny, and other stories are set at weddings, and there's a badminton story, and the characters, the parents and grandparents, still live with cultural memories and sometimes real memories of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, and they're often very funny about it. One man comments that he's lived under two oppressive regimes, Pol Pot's and his wife's.
Yeah.
So it's like Henny Youngman stuff, but it still works, and so has a nice way about him in talking about young lives and young gay lives often enough, and also the cultural divide between the youngsters and their parents, many of whom, for example, believe in reincarnation, and it's a big part of their lives. And the young people trying to dismiss this while also thinking, maybe they have a point, and worrying they should live their lives a little better.
So, Dwight, I think I read in the Times profile of So that ran recently that he has another book that's coming out.
Yeah, he does. I think next year. It's an unfinished novel, but I think he had largely finished it. I think it's almost the entire novel. I think one or two longer nonfiction pieces that have been published in the New Yorker. So you wonder with a young talent, especially you read a first novel sometimes and you think to yourself, does this person really have a lot in their account to draw from for a literary career? Or is this a first book that's kind of a one-shot, I've now spilled my autobiographical story that's my one great story, and there's not a lot left in there. And you wonder that with a young writer. And I'll be curious to see, I suspect that he had a lot of funds, intellectual and writerly funds, from which to draw. So I'm looking forward to this next collection.
It's got to be pretty unusual to have two books come out, your first and your second book both come out posthumously.
Yeah, I can't think of many other examples of that happening. But there is a tragic aura that surrounds posthumously published books. I mean, I'm thinking of John Kennedy O'Toole's New Orleans novel, Confederacy of Dunces. And for example, James Agee, he died before his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, A Death in the Family, came out. It lends these books this tragic aura that is compelling. It actually is a draw, whether it should be or not.
As young readers, did both of you say posthumous?
Posthumous.
When you read it? No?
I stumbled on that word. Yeah. We should talk sometime about all the words we didn't know how to pronounce till we were in our 30s.
Yes.
What was yours, Jen? You're saying that in a very knowing way.
Oh, I've had it pointed out to me a few times. I think calliope, which I even forget the definition of, but for some reason it came up. I was in my 20s working at Harper's Magazine, and it came up, I think, in an article that I was fact-checking. And I think I referred to it as calliope, and I was swiftly told it was calliope.
And best friend Penelope.
I love that you said that, because there's a street nearby here where I live in New Orleans called Calliope Street, and our GPS system calls it Calliope.
Oh, well, there you go. I'm in good company.
Right. But for mine that I got embarrassed, I mispronounced hyperbole when I was maybe close to 30. I said like hyperbole. I mean, my God. And
hyperbole is a perfectly fine word in its own.
Oh, the room kind of froze. And anyway, I'll never forget it.
All right, I'll go. Mild Red. I thought it was a very pretty name. It's much better than Mildred.
Mild Dread.
Wait, Mild Dread?
That's a good band name. Wow.
Mild Dread. It's like a metal band. I like it.
All right. On that note, let's run down the titles again. Jen?
Okay. Until Proven Safe, The History and Future of Quarantine by Jeff Maynard and Nicola Twilley.
And After Parties, short stories by Anthony Wiesna.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.